In this Marvel Superheroes Draft Guide, I'll be providing you with all of the information you need to know before diving into the format. I'll be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons for each color, I'll be providing archetype overviews, going through the combat tricks you need to be aware of, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, they are Power Up, Teamwork, Plans, and Connive. Power Up is an activated ability found on creatures that's pretty straightforward. You can activate each Power Up ability only once, and you can reduce the cost of the Power Up ability by the creature's mana cost if it entered this turn. So in the case of Aerial Doombot, you can play it as a 1-mana 1/1 flyer, and then eventually pay 6 mana to put 3 counters on it. Or if you already have 6 mana, you can pay 1 for the Aerial Doombot, and then the Power Up ability will only cost 5 to activate on that turn. The next mechanic is Teamwork, which is a mechanic found on instants and sorceries. When you play a Teamwork spell, as an additional cost to cast it, you can tap any number of creatures you control with total power equal to the Teamwork number or more. So in the case of Helicarrier Strike, that number would be 2, and then you get an added effect when you do use that Teamwork mode. Next is the Plans. This is a type of enchantment found in the set, and the way plans work is over time they get these plan counters, and then when a certain number of plan counters are put on them, you sacrifice the enchantment, and then you get a extra benefit for fully stacking up your plan. So in the case of Claim the Kingdom, when you get your 4th plan counter, you'll sacrifice it, and when you do, you put an indestructible counter on target creature you control. The final mechanic is Connive, which is also pretty straightforward. When a creature connives, you draw a card, then discard a card, and if you discarded a non-land card, you put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. Moving on to the top commons, kicking things off with white. At number 1 is Hero in Training. 3 mana for a 2/2 that when it enters draws a card is really, really nice, because if that creature ever trades off with one of your opponent's creatures, you're just up that card, up that resource, and it really helps you win the game. And if you control another hero, you gain 2 life, so it can even help you stabilize your life total. Number 2 is Web Up. 3 mana for a removal spell in white that can deal with any non-land permanent. Sure, it's an enchantment, so sometimes your opponent will be able to kill it and get their whatever you took away from them back, but it's a really nice rate at common. 3 mana, deal with pretty much anything you care about, and that's going to be great. And then at number 3 is Brave Brawler, a nice little 2-drop with lifelink and 2 power, so when you play this early in the game, it's going to have some nice utility and help buffer your life total or really force your opponent to trade with it, and if they don't have any answers right away, you get to maybe chip away and gain some life. And then eventually you can use that power-up mode, or if you draw it in the later stages of the game, just play it and immediately use the power-up mode, and you get a bit of a bigger creature that has lifelink. And in the later stages of the game, bigger creatures with lifelink are really good for racing situations and things like that. Next up is blue. At number 1 is Shield Deployment Drone. 3 mana for a 2/2 flyer that comes with a 1/1 buddy on the ground is a fantastic rate. 2/2 flyers are a little bit understated these days, but the extra 1/1 that you get really does help make up for that by giving you a chump blocker or the ability to trade with a 1 toughness creature. It can also be something that's useful when you are having like multi-blocks, like you can throw the 1/1 in addition to the 2/2 if you need to block a 3/3, something like that. Overall, lots of good value with Shield Deployment Drone, and it's even an artifact creature for the decks that care about that. At number 2 is Trickster's Stratagem. 4 mana for a removal spell in blue. Putting the creature into the opponent's library is basically like casting a removal spell on it, and you even get to connive, so in the mid stages of the game you can get rid of extra lands, or if you want to draw and discard and get rid of a spell, you can put a counter on a creature, which is pretty nice upside to have on your blue removal spell. And then at number 3 is We Say Thee Nay, which is a nice counter spell which scales decently into the game because of the teamwork that makes it counter spells unless they pay 4 mana once you get to the later stages of the game where you hopefully have 2 power worth of creatures in play to counter their spells. So these little counter spells, pretty nice to have, and when you do have it, you want to make sure you have other ways to spend your mana at instant speed, maybe a power-up ability or something like that. So if your opponent doesn't cast something that you want to counter, then you have other ways to spend your mana so it doesn't go to waste. Next up is black. At number 1 is Hour of Defeat. For 4 mana, you get to destroy target creature, surveil 1, instant speed. It's not the most efficient spell because it does cost 4, but the fact that it's instant speed and you get that surveil does help quite a bit, because especially in the mid to late game when you don't need extra lands, any lands you get to surveil away from the top of your deck are basically going to be like drawing a card, and that extra little card selection is really nice on this sort of instant speed removal. Next is Cruel Alliance. For 3 mana, you get a sorcery that says exile target creature with mana value 3 or less, and then if you use the teamwork for 2, 2, then you get to exile any creature and gain 3 life. So once you get to the mid stages of the game where you maybe don't want to kill a smaller creature, you can hopefully have a creature in play that can use that teamwork ability and then be able to take out something a little bit larger and also be able to gain 3 life, which is quite nice. And then at number 3 is Ninja of the Hand. 3 mana for a 2/2 Death Touch isn't the best rate, it's fine, but the real power comes from the power-up mode where you get to put a counter on it and make the opponent discard a card, which gives you a nice little 2-for-1 creature, which is really what you're looking for. So if you play this on turn 3 and then eventually activate it, that's fine, but also just waiting till turn 5 to play it and activate it immediately is also going to be pretty reasonable. Moving on to red, at number 1 is Lightning Strike. 2 mana, deal 3, instant speed, is a great removal spell. It can also target your opponent, so if you get them low, you can burn them out with this card. Just exactly what you're looking for in red removal. At number 2 is Crimson Operative, another one of these creatures that gets you some value when it comes into play. 4 mana for a 3/2 with Prowess is totally reasonable as a stat line, and then when it enters, you get to exile the top card of your library, and then until the end of the next turn, you can play that card, which means that if you exile a land, you can play it, and so generally you're going to be able to get some value when you play that Crimson Operative. It's also an artifact creature for the decks that care about artifacts, and it's a villain for the decks that care about villains. There's also Repulsor Blast at number 3. 4 mana, deal 5 is going to be a pretty solid removal spell, just decent rate, and then if you are teamworking it, you are going to get to deal 2 damage to your opponent, which is going to be pretty reasonable as well if you are trying to get your opponent low and apply that extra pressure to their life total. And then finally, in green, at number 1 is Undercover Scroll. For 2 mana, you get a 1/1 that says as long as there are 2 or more creature cards in your graveyard, it gets +2/+2 and is all creature types, and then you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color. So in the early turns of the game, when you play this, you're going to be using its mana mode a lot, tapping it to play your 4-drops and 5-drops ahead of schedule. But once you get to the mid stages of the game, once some creatures have traded off, even if you top deck this, it's not going to be a dead draw because it'll generally be a 3/3 by that point in the game, and a 3/3 is a lot more relevant to that stage of the game than a 1/1. So it's good early and solid late, and that's a good recipe for your 2-drops. Next up is Go Nuts. For just a single green mana, you get a sorcery that says choose 1. If it would cast using Teamwork, choose both instead, and the Teamwork is 3. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. You're generally not going to choose that one by itself. And then the other mode is target creature you control fights target creature an opponent controls. And so generally you're going to be able to either have a big creature already in play and just have it fight one of your opponent's creatures, or oftentimes you're going to have a creature in play, you're going to use the teamwork mode, put a counter on a creature, and have a creature fight target opponent's creature, and that's going to be really nice as well. You can choose 2 different creatures with these modes, so you can put a counter on one creature and then have a different creature do the fighting if you would like to diversify which threats you have, like maybe you don't want to keep putting counters on a creature that's already big or something like that. Overall, the fact that this just costs a single green mana means that you overall just get a lot of flexibility with this card, and as long as you're playing big creatures, which green wants to do, you're going to be pretty happy with this as a removal spell. And then at number 3 is Knight of Wundagore. For 2 mana, you get a 2/1 Trampler, which you might wonder why does it have trample, and it's because whenever you put a counter on another creature, you put a counter on this creature, and this only triggers once each turn, but there's plenty of ways to get counters on your creatures via power-up or things like Go Nuts, which we just talked about. And when you are able to have your 2-drop scale into the game quite nicely just by having other things passively work, a lot of cards just put counters on themselves naturally, that's going to be a pretty good recipe for a 2-drop. Moving on to the archetypes. First up is Red-White, which is a deck that cares about casting non-creature spells. Thor Odinson is a great card as a top-end threat for this deck. 5 mana for a 4/4 with Flying, Vigilance, and Prowess. So when you cast those non-creature spells, he's going to get double +1/+1 temporarily, and that's going to really help him crunch in for tons of damage in this aggressive strategy. Next up is Quake, Agent of Shield. 3 mana for a 3/3, totally fine stat line, and then when you cast a non-creature spell, you can tap a not target creature or land, which means that you can tap your opponent's blockers a lot of the way to get through for damage. And then Loki Lofison is 2 mana for a 2/1, which isn't the best stat line, it's fine, but then you can use it to copy your instants and sorceries, and then you can power him up and copy even bigger instants and sorceries. So if you're playing more of those in this sort of strategy, then Loki gets a little bit better in this sort of deck because you'll have more instants and sorceries when you care about casting these non-creature spells for your other cards. Next up is Blue-Black, which is a deck that cares about drawing your second card each turn. Kang, Temporal Tyrant, is reasonable as a 4 mana 3/4. When he attacks, he connives, which will draw you your second card a turn in many cases, and when you draw your second card each turn, you drain your opponent for 1. Next up is Madame Mask. It's a 5 mana 3/2, which isn't the best stat line, but when she enters, she connives, which will draw you your second card. And when you draw your second card each turn, you create a 2/1 black villain creature token with Menace. So that will trigger when Madame Mask comes in. So even if they kill the Madame Mask, you're still going to be left with that 2/1 most of the time. And then if Madame Mask sticks around, you can oftentimes try to find a way to trigger it in future turns to keep getting a 2/1 army of 2/1s. And then Pim Particles is a nice sort of card for this deck because it doesn't have a ton of big effects. It doesn't do tons of stuff, but it will draw you a card, which means it can help you trigger your other synergy pieces. Next is green-white, which is a deck that cares about heroes and going wide. Black Panther Vanguard is perfect for this deck. 4 mana, 4/4, totally reasonable stats. And when another non-token hero you control enters, you could either make a 1/1 or you can buff your entire team, which is just what you're looking for in this sort of deck. Okoye Dora Milaje Leader is also really good for this deck. 4 mana for a 3/2 isn't the best stat line, but it comes with 2 1/1s, so you get 5/4 worth of stats spread across 3 bodies. And it makes your attacking tokens have first strike, which when they're just 1/1s isn't the biggest deal, but sometimes you'll find a way to buff them, or sometimes your opponent will have 1 toughness creatures, and then it can actually matter. And then Khazar of the Savage Land is just a fantastic card for any green deck, but it's really good here because it makes 2 bodies for 1 card. It's going to get you some card advantage when you can play lands from the top of your library, and then the Zabu creature that you make is just going to be a nice growing threat over time as well. And so Khazar is also a great top-end card for this deck. Next up is red-blue, which is a deck that cares about artifacts. Iron Man, Master of Machines is the perfect payoff for this deck. It's 4 mana and it's just a 1/4 with flying and vigilance, but it's going to get buffed for each other artifact you control, which is great. And if you have an artifact enter and it attacks, then you are going to be able to get some card advantage from it, which is just going to help you find more artifacts and keep playing them and make your Iron Man get even bigger. Next is Iron Lad, Diverging Destiny, another flyer with vigilance, and it can also get you card advantage when you have artifacts, but this time if they are on top of your library. And so another little way to get some card advantage while also just chipping in for damage in the air. And then Machinesmith Automaton is a nice little common for this deck. If you do have tons of artifacts, just having a 2/2 that grows every time another artifact you control enters can just form a giant trampler relatively quickly. Next up is black-green, which is a deck that cares about having creatures in your graveyard, often with the threshold of 2 creatures being in your graveyard mattering. So Killmonger, Scourge of Wakanda, 4 mana 3/3, but if you have 2 or more creatures in your graveyard, he gets +2/+1, so he'll be a 5/4, and when he enters, you can sacrifice another creature, and when you do, you destroy target non-land permanent in opponent control. So if you only have 1 creature in your graveyard by the time you play Killmonger, you can oftentimes sacrifice 1 when he comes into play to get to that second creature, so he'll immediately be bigger, and to basically trade off your worst creature for whatever their best non-land permanent is, which is a pretty good deal as well. Next up is Claw, Sonic Subjugator, 3 mana for a 2/2, and when he enters, target player reveals a number of cards from their hand equal to 1 plus the number of creature cards in your graveyard. You choose one of them, that player discards that card. So going to get you some card advantage, and it's going to be more likely to nab a key spell from your opponent's hand if you have more creatures in your graveyard, because that will force them to reveal more cards from their hand. And then Punishing Punch is another really nice card for this deck. 3 mana to have your creature deal damage equal to twice its power to target creature and opponent controls wouldn't be the craziest card, but doing that for just a single mana, if you are able to get 2 or more creature cards into your graveyard, is quite nice and makes that a really good removal spell for this deck. Next up is white-blue, which is a deck that kind of cares about teamwork, but also can just play out as like a white-blue, like tempo deck, like a Flyers deck, that sort of thing, because there's just not that many teamwork cards in the set as a whole. Captain America Living Legend is a great card for this deck, though. 3 mana, 3/4 with Vigilance is just good stats, and when a creature you control becomes tapped during your turn, if it's the first time that creature has become tapped this turn, untap it. And so that will work if you are tapping your creature for a teamwork ability, but also if you're just attacking them with a creature, then the creature will untap, which is just pretty relevant in racing situations. And that's why playing like a white-blue Flyers strategy can be pretty nice, because your Flyers can tap, and then they can also be held back on defense a little bit. Agent Maria Hill is like the only payoff for teamwork specifically. If you are using this to cast a teamwork spell, you get to put a counter on her and draw a card. There just aren't that many teamwork cards in the set, so if you do see an early Agent Maria Hill, don't think that your deck is going to have like 12 teamwork cards in it or something like that. It's going to be much more of an incremental value type card, but still being a 1 mana 2/1 makes it a card that you're happy playing in this sort of shell. And then a card like Falcon Winged Wonder just plays into this kind of tempo-y Flyers type strategy that you can play, getting good value, putting a couple of Flyers into play, and also just being able to attack, and then maybe if you have Captain America, untap him so you can hold him back on defense, things like that. Just having this sort of Flyers backup plan is really nice to have in this sort of deck, because as I mentioned, the teamwork stuff isn't that well supported. Next up is red-green, which is the deck that cares about the power-up mechanic. So Hulk Gamma Goliath is fantastic. It's a giant creature, and he makes your power-up abilities of other creatures you control cost 3 less to activate, which is quite a bit. And you can activate his own power-up ability for 8 mana and put 5 counters on him, which just turns him into an 11/5 trampler. And so he's a really scary card. She-Hulk Jade Defender is another good creature with power-up. 4 mana, 4/4 reach trample is already fine. And then when you activate her power-up ability, you can destroy an artifact or enchantment and put a counter on her. So be able able to deal like with one of your opponent's problematic cards that maybe they aren't counting on you being able to have an answer for. And then Wonder Man Hollywood Hero is another great synergy piece for this deck because he lets you activate your power-up abilities in additional time, which just lets you get extra value, makes your creatures extra big, and overall is a really nice card already attached to a 5-mana 4/4 flyer, and he can even activate his own power-up ability to put some counters onto himself. Next up is White Black, which is a deck that cares about your creatures attacking alone. So Black Widow Double Agent is a great example of this. 3/2 Death Toucher for 3, and when a creature you control attacks alone, it gains First Strike and Menace until end of turn. So Black Widow can attack by herself as a 3/2 First Strike, Menace, Death Touch, and First Strike and Death Touch is one of those elite combos that makes it really hard for your opponent to do anything, because First Strike plus Death Touch just kills their creature before it gets to deal damage most of the time. Agent 13 Sharon Carter is really nice in this sort of deck because when your creatures attack alone, you're going to get clue tokens, and then those clue tokens can be sacrificed to get you extra resources so you can keep pulling ahead in your mid-range game, even if you are going to make the game go long by only attacking with one creature at a time. And then Luke Cage Power Man is a creature that can always pretty much attack alone because he's going to get +2/+0 and indestructible. So attacking as a 4-mana 4/5 indestructible is quite nice. You might notice no black cards on this list. That's because there's not really a ton of payoffs for black cards that are just benefiting you for attacking alone, but black is of course going to be providing supplemental removal spells and things of that nature to this strategy. Next up is Blue-Green, which is a deck that cares about +1/+1 counters. So Ant-Man Colony Commander, 3 mana for a 2/2 isn't the best stat line, but when he attacks, you can pay 1. And if you do put a counter onto a creature, which is a little bit rough because attacking with your 2/2 when you've played him on turn 3, like turn 4 attacking with a 2/2, oftentimes they will have an answer for that. But whenever you put a counter on a creature, you get a 1/1 insect creature token. It only triggers once each turn. But if Ant-Man is able to consistently attack, you can make a growing threat and also make an army of 1/1s. You can also just put that counter onto any target creature that you care about, so that's worth knowing as well. Doc Samson's also nice for this deck, 5 mana for a 3/6, but if you would put one or more counters on a permanent you control, you put that many of those, each of those kinds of counters +1 instead, so you get 2 counters instead of 1 every time you would get one, and then you can tap him for a bunch of mana as well. And then Kid Loki, you'll notice there's a lot of overlap in some of the synergy pieces for these decks, but Kid Loki's nice because it's a 1 mana 1/1, and a creature that you control, if you put a counter on this turn, has hexproof, which is pretty nice because hexproof on your creatures, maybe you have some power-up ability, all of a sudden the power-up ability also gives your creature hexproof to protect it from removal if your opponent's trying to answer it, and whenever you draw your second card each turn, you put a +1/+1 counter on Kid Loki. So if you are playing this in maybe a blue-black deck, you care more about that part of the card where you get a growing threat. But in this sort of deck, you'll have some card draw effects, presumably, and then you can use your Loki, get some counters on him, and then your other creatures that are getting counters on them can get some hexproof, which can also be useful for like protecting them from removal and stuff like that. So nice little synergy piece for your blue-green counters strategy. And then finally, we have Black-Red, which is a deck that cares about villains. So Madam Hydra is 4 mana for a 2/3, but whenever you cast a villain spell, you get a 2/1 black villain creature token with Menace. So pretty easy to make an army of villains if you have lots of villains in your deck to cast. Arnim Zola Biofanatic, 3 mana for a 2/3, but you can spend 3 to tap it and to create a 2/1 black villain creature token with Menace. You can only activate that if there's 2 or more creature cards in your graveyard. So again, kind of a synergy piece with the black-green deck as well, but really good here for making an army of villains as well. And then Hydra Assault Robot goes well when you're making an army of villains because whenever another villain and or artifact you control enters, it deals 1 damage to target opponent. So you can start pinging your opponent down. And notably, it does say another artifact as well. So if you are playing an artifact strategy that's more aggressive, this card can also fit into that shell. So you'll notice that a lot of the cards kind of overlap into the multiple strategies, and that's definitely something to keep an eye on, especially when drafting, because sometimes that means you can take a card early and know that it can fit pretty well into multiple homes. Next up are the combat tricks. There are a ton of them in this set at common and uncommon. In white, there's Panther Pounce and Take Up the Shield. So Panther Pounce, just +1/+0, but it'll give flying and untap a creature and investigate, and then Take Up the Shield, put a counter on a creature, it gains lifelink and indestructible. And also remember that if your opponent has creatures with prowess, even something like Panther Pounce, which is just giving +1/+0, gets a little bit better with prowess creatures because then the prowess will trigger as well. Blue has a few combat tricks as well. Super Suit is going to give +1/+2, untap the creature, and it's an equipment, so it'll stick around permanently. D-Power can give -4/-0 and draw a card, and can be often cast for just a single blue mana, which is pretty scary. So if your opponent is holding up that mana, it can definitely be something to keep in mind. And then I Am Iron Man is also another card that's worth keeping in mind because it can turn even a random artifact into a 4/4 and draw a card, so it'll replace itself. Definitely potential for a 2-for-1 with that one. Green gets Giant Growth, so just +3/+3 for 1 mana. Black gets Stolen Stark Tech, so it can give +1/+0 and Indestructible temporarily, and then the equipment sticks around, and Widow's Bite, which can give -2/-2 at instant speed, which is kind of a removal spell, but also can give Death Touch. So if there's a small creature, then the Death Touch can definitely matter there. And then the combo of those with Teamwork can sometimes be like you get to shrink something and give something Death Touch and like win a combat that way. And then red has several combo tricks: Super Speed for +1/+0 and First Strike until end of turn. Also can give Haste, Blazing Crescendo +3/+1, and then can get you a little bit of card advantage. Team Tactics can give Double Strike and sometimes Trample if you are getting that Teamwork enabled. And then Hire Crew can buff the entire team while creating a 2/1 villain creature token with Menace. So it can give all those creatures +1/+0. So keep that in mind, especially if your opponent makes a giant attack. Next up are some trap cards to avoid, or at least be careful when playing. Rewrite History is a plan that gets plan counters when one or more creatures you control become tapped, and then it will pop when you get the 4th plan counter. And the thing about this is if you're relying on getting plan counters by your creatures attacking to tap, this is going to be really slow, take a really long time. And also, if you're on the back foot, it just won't do much because your creatures aren't going to be able to attack if you're on the back foot. So if you are planning on putting this card in your deck, make sure you have some ways to tap your creatures that doesn't involve them attacking. So things like Teamwork abilities or stuff of that nature. And that's especially nice because then if you are able to attack, that'll put a plan counter on this. And then you can also trigger the creatures tapping from multiple ways. And so maybe it won't just take 4 turns for this to go. You can also trigger this in multiple ways. And so just be careful putting Rewrite History in your deck if your only way to get those plan counters is by attacking. Too Evil to Stay Dead is another card you need to be really careful playing. Generally speaking, you would rather just put a 3-drop into your deck than play Too Evil to Stay Dead, because in the early stages of the game, you often won't have something to get back with this. And by the time you are getting something back, you could have just played a different 3-drop that was relatively equal in power level and gotten played that and had the option of playing that instead of having to rely on bringing something back from the graveyard. So just keep that in mind. Unless you have a really premium 3 or 4 drop to get back, then Too Evil to Stay Dead is not going to be a card you are particularly interested in. And the Teamwork ability costing 4 means that by the time you're casting that, you could also just have like a giant creature in your deck. So if that's the primary mode of the card that you want, okay, but just put a more expensive card in your deck. There's just better things to play than Too Evil to Stay Dead. And then Training Regiment, 4 mana, and then just putting 1 counter onto your creatures every turn does give some inevitability. But if you don't have like some synergy pieces like in the blue-green deck we looked at where Ant-Man's getting you 1/1s every time you do that or something like that, if you don't have those synergy pieces, it's just too slow. You can't spend 4 mana and just start getting 1/1 worth of stats every single turn, because if your opponent just has like an answer to your whatever creature you're putting those counters on, or if you just don't have any creatures in play when you play this, like your opponent killed your 3-drop, all of a sudden like Training Regimen just doesn't do anything for a couple turns and you're just in really bad shape. So only put this card in your deck if you have tons and tons of ways to use those counters other than just growing your creatures. Next up are some combos that you can assemble. First is the combo between Atlantean Cavalry and Attuma, Atlantean Warlord. These are the only 2 merfolk in the set outside of 1 merfolk at Mythic Rare. But Atlantean Cavalry, when you play it on turn 3, it's a 3/2 Vigilance, and when you draw your second card each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Attuma says other merfolk you control get +1/+1, and whenever 1 or more merfolk you control attack a player, draw a card. So if you curve Atlantean Cavalry into Attuma, then attack with the Atlantean Cavalry, you'll draw another card because of the Attuma, which will turn the Atlantean Cavalry from a 3/2, which is getting +1/+1 from the Attuma, into a 4/3, plus the extra counter that it'll get for drawing your second card into a 5/4, just from that 1 attack, and draw you a card. And that's just a pretty cool curve to be aware of, though generally it would work out in such a way where if you have Attuma, you can sometimes just play that because he's a fine card on his own, because when he attacks, you'll draw cards, and that can sometimes be useful. But the Atlantean Cavalry is a sort of card you don't really want to play unless you have tons of ways to draw extra cards, or you have an Attuma already in your deck. Another cool combo is between Hawkeye Young Avenger and Photon Blast Barrage. Hawkeye Young Avenger is a 2/4 with reach and says if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or permanent an opponent controls, instead it deals that much damage plus X, where X is Hawkeye's power. And then Photon Blast Barrage is X red red. When you cast this spell, copy it X times. You may choose new targets for the copies. Photon Blast Barrage deals 1 damage to target creature. So if you have Hawkeye in play, all of those instances are of 1 damage or going to be replaced by 1 plus X, where X is Hawkeye's power. So often just like +2. So instead of dealing 1 damage a bunch of times with the Photon Blast Barrage, you'll be dealing 3 damage a bunch of times with the Photon Blast Barrage, which can just very quickly wipe out your opponent's entire board state. And the final combo I want to talk about is an infinite combo available in this set. It's really sweet, really hard to assemble, but I wanted to mention it briefly. If you have the Thing, Ben Grimm, which whenever a hero you control deals damage to a player, you put 2 counters on the Thing. Then you get Invisible Woman, Sue Storm, which is whenever you put a counter on a creature, which would trigger with the Ben Grimm, you get to create a 0/4 colorless wall creature token with Defender. If you have Mr. Fantastic, Reed Richards, whenever 1 or more tokens you control enter, you draw a card. And if you have Human Torch, Johnny Storm, whenever you draw a card, if you control another hero, Human Torch deals 1 damage damage to target opponent. And so when you have all 4 of these together, you have the Human Torch will ping your opponent for 1 damage. That will give the Thing Ben Grimm 2+1/+1 counters, which will have the Invisible Woman trigger, which will make you a 0/4 wall, which will make you a token so that Mr. Fantastic Reed Richards will draw you a card, which will then draw you a card so that Human Torch will ping them again. And so you can just repeat this loop however many times you want. The Mr. Fantastic trigger is a May ability. The Invisible Woman one is also a May ability. And so you don't have to like loop it infinite times if it would cause you to deck yourself or something, but it'll just make a giant Thing Ben Grimm and you'll ping your opponent out of the game and make a bunch of 0/4s and stuff of that nature and just draw so many cards. So if you ever do assemble this combo, come back to this video, leave a comment down below because I would love to hear that fantastic story, because it's an awesome 4-card combo that goes infinite with all uncommons and 4 different colors, and it's kind of crazy, but it's a really cool thing to be able to assemble in draft. Next up is the mana fixing in this set, which is especially relevant if you're trying to splash. In each pack, there is a 50% chance that the basic land will be replaced by one of these common dual lands that come into play tapped and gain you a life. So a card like Stark Industries, there's one of these for each of the 2 color combinations in the set, and they are going to be replacing the basic land 50% of the time. There's also Surveillance Room at common as a way to fix your mana. Not something you would generally love playing in a 2-color deck, but if you're splashing, can definitely be useful. Baxter Building is another way to help fix your mana as a land at uncommon, and then Dependable Quinjet is a colorless way at common to add mana of any color, and then can sometimes even turn into a 3/3 flyer, albeit at a pretty steep crew cost of 4 once you get to the mid or late game. There's also this cycle of basic land cyclers at common. So Burrow Backup, Aim Scientists, Rocks and Brutes, Kree Sentinel, and Savage Land Dinosaur all have 2 basic land cycling. So you pay 2 mana, discard it, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, which can definitely be used for mana fixing as well. There's also some other sources of mana fixing in this set. Restorative Technique, you can get basic lands from your deck, which can definitely be used for splashing, and it'll also ramp you so you can cast cards ahead of schedule. And then there's some treasure makers in the set. So Ant-Man's Army can make a treasure token, Stark Industries Executive can make treasure tokens, and Death to Our Enemies can make treasure tokens. And so if you are using these cards for fixing purposes to splash a card, make sure you don't use those treasure tokens frivolously. Make sure you save them so you can use them to cast your splash card when you eventually draw it. And that if you are using it to power out a card ahead of schedule, then you are conscious of the fact that it's making it harder for you to cast your splash card. There's also 2 lands at uncommon that can be used for splashing for very specific cards. So if you have Avengers Tower, it can be useful for splashing hero spells or hero creatures, generally speaking. And then Villainous Hideout can be used for splashing villain spells. So if you have a villain that's really strong or a hero that's really strong that you want to splash, these can definitely help with that as well. Moving on to some final tips. First of all, there are lots of synergistic cards that aren't part of a full deck. So if you see a card like Iron Fist Living Weapon, which cares about when you cast a spell that targets a creature you control, that card gets better if you have like combat tricks in your deck. So you play a combat trick targeting one of your creatures, all of a sudden Iron Fist can tap himself and like deal damage to any target until end of turn, which is just pretty useful to have as an upside, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to build an entire deck around him. It's just more of like enable him with some synergy around him. Similarly, a card like Ronin Shadowstalker rewards you for having equipment in your deck. There's not really an equipment deck. There's not tons of equipment cards in the set, but if you do have a Ronin Shadowstalker, having some equipments in your deck and prioritizing them a little bit higher can make these cards a lot better and turn them into solid cards in your deck without necessarily having to build your entire deck around one piece of a strategy. Another tip is strong cards with hybrid mana costs get an extra boost in the early stages of the draft. So if you see a card like US Agent John Walker, it's 3 black-white hybrid, and it's this card that's going to be pretty useful for a variety of strategies, being a 3/2 that comes into play with an equipment and then it auto attaches to him. And that's like a nice card to have access to, and because of the hybrid mana cost, you can play this in a white deck or a black deck, which means that you get some extra flexibility when you take this card early in your draft, and so as a result can be prioritized a little bit more when you aren't sure what colors you're drafting quite yet. That's going to do it for this video, though. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe for more, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And if you made it all the way to the end of the video, leave hashtag #SuperDrafter in the comments section down below. That's going to do it for this one, though. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll talk to you next time.